This episode was originally recorded for Symmetry Live and is being refurbished here for your enjoyment.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Symmetry Live. This is Natasha Helfer, and I'm thrilled to have with me today Alan Alexander from California and Colette Dalton from Utah as part of our provider panel. We do these Symmetry Lives most Fridays, not all Fridays, the Fridays that were available around this time, lunchtime, taking either questions from the audience and or addressing things that have come up kind of culturally or any other topic that we may think is important to discuss as far as for an audience. So today I wanted to address, several times that have come to my attention where I have, what I want to say, offended, or where I have not presented correctly in regards to the asexual community, and an apology that I would like to put forward in that behalf. I think that the complaints that I have received, which I can think of 3 now in probably the last 7 years of my doing presentations from asexual individuals, are very legitimate and usually have something to do with the fact that as I'm presenting or talking about sexual matters from a sexual health perspective, that the way that I phrase things or talk about things minimizes or marginalizes asexual people who are in the audience, which is, of course, the last thing I want to do. And yet I have to own that and see what is it that I'm doing that is consistently bringing that issue up. So I thought we would start by just talking about asexuality in general and some of the information that we know. And then I would address why, in my attempts to sexually educate, particularly an audience that comes from kind of like a religiously conservative, what I would call sex negative space, and also maybe a pleasure-averse space, why in talking about those issues, sometimes that may come across as being dismissive of an orientation, which is definitely not what I'm about. So why don't we talk a little bit about asexuality? And I know, Ellen, in our provider meeting, you had shared a little bit about, AVEN and just asexuality.com and just some resources. So do you want to start off the conversation just with kind of expressing a little bit about what we are even talking about when we say asexual, and what the asexual orientation, how it's defined, and how people who identify that way would talk about themselves or their community?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So AVEN is the Asexuality Visibility and Education Network. They're located at asexuality.org. If you want more information, they have a great FAQ there and resources. They also have forums where you can reach out and open discussions with others who've identified as asexual. You can explore that at your own leisure. Also, how it's defined, AVEN itself defines it as someone who does not experience sexual attraction or intrinsic desire to have sexual relationships. So again, it's all talking about how are you feeling inside? What is your authentic self telling you? And it's not up to any mental health provider or professional to tell you how you identify, but we are very curious. We're insatiably curious. So it may come across as we're questioning your orientation, and that's never how we want to come across. What we want to do is we want to explore to understand. And that's perhaps what you'll encounter when you meet providers, is they will start asking questions, not to doubt you, but to help them understand where you're coming from. And also it kind of lays that fertile ground for that own self-exploration process.
And I do want to just say right off the bat that none of us here identify as asexual. I know Alan and Colette both identify within the LGBTQ plus umbrella, but none of us on this panel identify as asexual. And I do have plans to interview 1, if not 2 different asexual people that have been on my radar for Mormon Sex Info podcast, because I think it is really an important aspect of sexuality to have better information out there about. For example, I know Clara DeLynn, who's in our community, has written a book called ACE. And so I'm going to make sure that that's a link to that book is posted on this particular Symmetry Live as well. But yeah, Colette, what would be kind of your initial thoughts?
Well, I want to kind of continue off what Alan said. I think, had a pretty good discussion in our provider meeting, and I really appreciated one thing that Sarah, one of our other providers, was talking about, the idea of identity foreclosure. And as Alan was saying, I think part of our job as ethical providers is to be able to help you figure yourself out. And so we do ask questions, not to invalidate you by any means, but to better understand your experience. I tell clients all the time, you know, I may be a mental health professional, but you're the expert on you. I view this as a collaborative experience and making sure that we can work together to figure out how to best help you. And part of that is asking questions. And part of that is being able to help educate you. Because when you grow up in a high demand purity culture religion like Mormonism, there are people who may think that they're asexual, and they very well may be. And I hope that when we're in these individual conversations, we're not saying, oh no, you're not asexual. That's identity foreclosure in a way, and very invalidating. But we may be saying, you know, sometimes people think they're asexual and there may be other things going on that we need to examine. One thing we do a lot of times as sex therapists is let's rule out any physical issues. Are there things going on there hormonally that may be making you have that different sex drive? Is there a difference in sex drive between you and your partner or partners that make you feel asexual when that's not what's going on? Broadening the discussion, Natasha, I thought, gave a really good example of when someone comes in and says, hey, I got aroused while watching gay porn, does that mean I'm gay? We're not going to say, oh yeah, totally, let's celebrate this. This is great. We're going to provide some education saying, yeah, maybe you are. Or let's provide some education saying that it's very natural for people to get aroused while watching pornography, no matter the orientation. That doesn't mean that you are automatically gay by watching gay porn. So the same thing with asexuality. Yeah, you could be asexual. However, let's explore how the impact of growing up in a purity culture religion, growing up in a very shame, pleasure-averse society and religion can be impacting your sexuality. If you are asexual, great, we can work with that. But let's look at other things too to make sure that we are being good, ethical providers, looking at a holistic view and not necessarily doing identity foreclosure, saying, yep, this is it, let's do it, let's run, without doing a whole holistic perspective.
Well, so first of all, the ideas about identity foreclosure and that language comes from James Marcia, who has written quite a bit about this. Here's where I would probably contextualize this a little bit too. I think it's different when I have a client who comes in and says, I'm gay, you know, and I've got this relationship issue. They may not even tell me they're gay necessarily. I mean, just like a straight person would come in and say, hey, I've got this issue that I'm working on, or I've got a relational thing, or, you know, I've got a sexual dysfunction issue, and they orient as gay or lesbian or bisexual or asexual. And they're coming in with that identity. That is not ever an identity that I question, ever. Like, well, are you sure you're gay? Or why do you think you're gay? Or, you know, why do you think you're asexual, et cetera? When a client comes in and says, I'm wondering if I'm gay or bisexual or asexual, and they're in a sense looking for kind of sexual expertise on those things. And that's when I think that curiosity space is appropriate. And, you know, why are you thinking that? What's going on in your life? What do you understand about those terms and labels, et cetera? And so I think in the context of where I owe an apology, it's that the reason why, so let me just say what happens, right? So, I've said this several times. I have said something along the lines in several presentations talking about post-Mormon women in particular who come into my office. So this is my lived experience as a clinician who works a lot with both nuanced and post-Mormons. I get the question a lot from post-Mormon women. I wonder if I'm asexual. They're coming in for low desire complaints. I wonder if I'm asexual. So that's not them saying I am. I'm wondering if. And I have noticed that 20 to 30% of my post-Mormon women who are coming in with low libido, concerns or distress around the fact that they consider themselves low libido are asking me this kind of a question. Whereas in the national kind of statistics, we have, probably about 1 to 1.5% of the population identifying as asexual. So it's a fairly small percent of the population. So for me, that's a big discrepancy, which I think at times can be, I think that the contextual piece that you were just talking about, Colette, needs to just at least be explored. Needs to be explored as one of the reasons why you may be comfortable at the end of our time working together identifying or not identifying as asexual, which of course is also something that is client-based, not therapist-based. That's a big shift too that's happened, I think, in the therapy community. Is I think 20 years ago, we're the ones that would have said, well, you are, but you fit the criteria for this particular label. Whereas now I think therapists, ethical therapists, are much more about stepping back, and it's not my job to come up with your identity and your orientation and what is that like for you. So I think that the complaint, which I think is valid, is that if I say something like that, specifically calling out asexuality as the word that I'm using, and I'm doing that as the first time that I'm even bringing up asexuality, I think that asexual people in the audience may feel like, well, she's in a sense delegitimizing this orientation, that instead of being believed, like, hey, I'm asexual, people might be like, well, are you? Because I heard Natasha say that this may be a Mormon sexual repression issue, right? And so then feel kind of not legitimized in their orientation. So this is one of those kind of really big yes ands where I have to figure out, if I'm going to say things like that, I need to first and foremost legitimize asexuality, and then maybe complicate it with, if you're in that exploratory phase, which I think a lot of post-Mormons are, because we don't grow up in a culture that encourages sexual exploration or sexual identity exploration or sexual orientation or gender identity. None of those things are allowed to be explored in our culture. And so a lot of people are in that process of kind of figuring themselves out. And it could be a reason why you're experiencing low desire or not a lot of sexual interest in that particular moment of your life. But that does not delegitimize asexuality as an orientation. And for the people who land in that space, having, like you said, not necessarily in an identity foreclosure way, but have given themselves the permission to explore and have done their own personal work and feel comfortable with their own identity, that's legitimate. That's completely legitimate. Alan, you had talked a little bit about just kind of context, and I don't know, what are your thoughts about that? And well, maybe actually I'm going to ask Colette first, because I know you've got to go in like 3 minutes. So what are your last thoughts before you have to go? And then Alan and I will continue the conversation.
Well, I appreciate your clarification, and I recognize that this is a bigger conversation than we can tackle in 20 minutes. And we don't want this to delegitimize or have people feel more marginalized at all. So asexuality is legitimate, and we want to recognize that. And it's sometimes hard. Natasha brought the idea of a lot of times in like general conference, we can get upset with people giving this sort of stuff that's general advice, thoughts, things, not realizing the individual lived experience. And I'm just want to be aware of that here too, that there's a difference between us talking in generalities and providing education. And it's different than if we were one-on-one therapy or coaching, looking and exploring these sort of issues. But it is a legitimate orientation, and we are happy to affirm you in that if that's what's going on. And we want to recognize that that may not be what's going on. I don't know if that really helps at all, but it's a complicated thing. And I think we're still learning a lot about asexuality and different labels. I think labeling can be super helpful, but as I tell people, labeling's helpful until it's not. Labeling can be helpful in you feeling affirmed and finding your community, finding people that get it, that are dealing with some of the same stuff you are. But it can also be helpful because language does have issues, and language has limitations in being able to describe things. And there's so many different orientations out there, because when we think of attraction, I mean, this is just asexual. There's a romantic. We have different types of attraction as far as the sexual, as far as romantic, as far as intellectual, and so there's so many different things to explore. I know we're way oversimplifying this, but I appreciate being able to give a few thoughts.
Thank you, Colette. And I know you're running off to see a client, but thank you for sharing some of your perspectives today. And Alan, when we were talking earlier, you had brought up kind of there's a life developmental perspective to a lot of this, as well as fluidity. So this is something too where I get nervous anytime I hear like sex positive therapists talk about, orientation is fluid and, people can shift and change over life, which is in theory wonderful. But then when I'm thinking about it from my Mormon background and brain, I'm like, oh no, people are going to see this. If we talk about orientation being fluid, people are going to weaponize that. Religious people can weaponize that in a form of saying, well, if it's fluid, why isn't it a choice? And therefore, why are you choosing to sin, right? So I don't know if you want to kind of go into some of, just from a NOMO perspective, which that's our new thing at Symmetry is we're loving having a NOMO around, but just kind of how we can talk about fluidity, identity, life development, and how all of those things play a role in how people identify.
Sure. Well, I think we could go back to how Avon defined asexuality. And I think a key word in there is intrinsic, which means it is part of who you are. It's intrinsic to you. And just because something is intrinsic doesn't mean you're a static person. And it doesn't mean you're choosing. What is intrinsic to you just is. It's not something you chose. You can't say, I'm going to be intrinsically some other thing that you are not, because that doesn't ring true. And what we're talking about here is authenticity, not choice. We choose things all the time that are not intrinsic or authentic to ourselves. That's where the choice is. The choice is conformity or authenticity, not
who you are,
sinner or worthy.
Mm-hmm.
That's an illegitimate argument. The legitimate argument is, are you being authentic to yourself? Or are you conforming to external pressures? And conforming to external pressures, this is nothing more than an adult version of peer pressure, that we're not going to be appreciated, loved, worthy if we don't behave, if we don't conform to standards that we ourselves don't allow us to explore who our authentic selves are. But as soon as those pressures are off, as soon as you step outside of that box, then all of a sudden you're left with these questions. And I think that's where you're encountering these women who are coming in and they're saying, for so long I conformed. Who authentically am I? And that's where the fluidity comes in. It's flowing towards your authentic self and away from enforced conformity. That's what's really going on.
Yeah. No, I love that. And that's that enforced conformity from a sexual lens perspective. And I would say this even includes the asexual people that come from Mormonism. That's not an orientation that is allowed. It's like, from a Mormon perspective, really the only legitimate way to show up sexually is heterosexual in a traditional marriage, where you're, a big part of the goal, not the only part, but a big part of the goal of sex is baby making, making more Mormon families. And a lot of how the Mormon kind of rhetoric is that your identity is tied up into that. Your identity is tied into whether or not you're a parent, whether or not you're in a heterosexual marriage and what that means for you. So whether it's that you're asexual, whether you're homosexual, whether you're bisexual, whether you're transgender, whether you're intersex, all of those are just not even considered really legitimate perspectives, or not even perspectives, just identities, ways of being. And so I really love what you just said. I think what I was trying to get to and where I made my mistake is I delegitimized a population by talking about this exploratory period that I hope, a lot of both male and female and everyone in between is able to explore the many reasons, like even when somebody comes in for low desire and is not considering their orientation at all, there's so many different things that could be going on. Are you depressed? Are you on medication? Are you enjoying the sex that you're having, or is the sex that you're having not really that pleasurable, meaning I could take it or leave it, right? I mean, there's is there attraction for your current partner? Are you integrated with your gender identity is oftentimes questions I'm asking. I'm also asking questions about orientation and who, your history, your developmental history. Is there unresolved trauma? There's so many things. But where I probably can identify with this the most is as a sexual abuse survivor. So whenever I'm in presentations where they're trying to explain sexual abuse survivors, I notice myself getting ticky. I get ticky because I feel like there's general brush sweepings and what do we know about sexual abuse survivors? Well, we know that as far as the research is concerned, there can be a correlation with like sexual activity or non-sexual activity, right? In other words, people get averse to sexual activity because of trauma, or they may become more sexually active as a way to deal with that sexual trauma. Well, then I'm like, well, so are you going to look at my sexual life and make all these assumptions about my sexual choices due to my trauma? Right? That's where I get ticky. So I understand, it's like we're trying to understand general human behavior, but there's also individual stories in each one of those scenarios that may or may not identify or feel comfortable with how the general population that they identify with is being addressed or talked about. And that can feel very othering. So anyways, I just want to own that there's something I need to do different here, and I'm going to be really mindful about it. I'm not apologizing for my clinical lived experience, because I do think there's something there about sexual oppression and the culture we come from. I am apologizing that the way I've communicated about that has left people, especially in the asexual community, feeling delegitimized and unseen, and maybe even that my comments would in some way be weaponized by other people in not believing asexual people when they say I'm asexual. And so for that, I am incredibly sorry, and we'll be working on that. So any final thoughts from you, Alan?
I would just say that when you hear therapists talk about things, we're being true to our educational roots in that we're taught theories and generalities, but that's just to conceptualize human behavior, which to me, anybody who's taken a statistics class or had education, you have heard all about what's normal or normative from maybe a mathematical or statistical standpoint. And to me, that's the only place it has value, is in that bell curve saying, oh, it's a normative distribution or it's not. But that doesn't mean that we're describing, I don't like to describe behavior as normal or not. I just like to describe behavior as it's what people tend to do. It's what we say, things like tend to, generally, mostly, things like that. And that's because we're painting with that broad brush. We really are. But the underlying goal is then, well, what do we do with that? Well, then we sit down and we talk to you individually. When I was running groups with my adolescents, I tend to explain that as you're going to hear me say things like generally, etc. And I'm just talking about things in a very broad sense. And so think of it as like I'm talking about snow. So we talk about snow because it's generally cold. It tends to be white. Generally speaking, it happens when it's really cold outside and it crystallizes and it falls to the ground. These are those broad strokes. Then what we do is we get in the room and we want to meet with you individually, either as a couple, a family, or an individual, because that's when we're looking at that one snowflake. Because the other mirror side of that picture we're painting is individual differences. Things tend to go away a certain way or in a certain form, but then your individual differences is what makes you unique, is what makes you special, is what makes you different. That's what we're learning about. That's where our curiosity comes from. That's why we ask questions, is we want to know specifically what's going on with you. It's not to delegitimize, but it's to find out, because that's where the real connection and that's where the real therapy occurs, is getting to know the individual. So
yeah, which is not what I'm doing when I'm presenting in front of an audience, right? That's and I also want to just clarify quickly too. The only reason why I choose the asexual word is not because I'm just drawing that out of, you know, thin air. That's the word that people are asking me about. And I think in a way that also speaks to the incredible amount of work the asexual community has done in advocating for themselves, right? The fact that we know what asexuality is, the fact that we consider it an orientation, the fact that we have, you know, websites like asexuality.com, I think it is. We'll make sure and link to that org. Thank you. Is because, you know, people have spoken up like, hey, this is my experience. And I think that one of the things that I think just the mental health community as a whole has had to reckon with is that we have pathologized people on both sides of the spectrum of sexuality, right? So if you have high libido, you get pathologized in the sense of, you know, you're an addict or you're an nymphomaniac or, you know, all those kinds of terms. And then if you're on the asexual side, it's like, oh, you're frigid or low libido, or you have trauma, or you have, you know, all these reasons people come up with, but it's been pathologized in the mental health field. Mm-hmm. And so the big shift that's happening from a sex positive space, I would say in the last decade, is that these are not pathologies, right? And if you're asexual, that does not mean I'm sick or diseased or need help or need therapy to fix my asexuality. And even the sex therapy field, I think, has been historically at fault for, you know, just assuming that everybody should be sexual and everybody should have a sexual life. And if you're not somehow figuring out your sex life, there must be something wrong with you. So that is an incredible shift that's really just about, I think, about a decade old, as far as like, at least in the mainstream kind of discussion and dialogue. And so I think that just our fields have to own that we've misstepped in this area a lot. The second thing I wanted to say, just kind of as my closing thought, is that queer ethical theory and affirmative care, as far as therapists are concerned, is providing a space for neutral self-discovery, which means I'm allowing for a space for you to consider all these things with maybe the education that I'm offering, but from a neutral space, that at least me as the therapist, I'm not going to be leaning you or, you know, encouraging you or influencing you to identify as asexual or not, or any other orientation. And I really love that language, because that's, in a sense, that's what I'm trying to just point out, is that if you're coming from Mormonism, you've had zero neutral space to have any type of sexual self-discovery. And that's unfair. And that's kind of a trauma in of itself. And that's where I'm hoping to just have people be willing to question all these different things, and to finally, you know, when they do finally come up with the labels that feel really authentic, like you're saying, that they can feel confident and good about where they're landing, regardless of what that label is, or whether or not they even want a label. And the labels, the ABC labels for the rainbow sphere, continue to grow. And it's really a lovely thing, right? I remember at first I was kind of like, oh no, all these labels. I don't know all the labels and I can't figure them all out. And that was like a really stupid thing for me to think, because the more, terms there are, that means the more people are, self-discovering. What was that? You had mentioned a teen that labeled himself. What was it was so lovely, like all these different things.
Yes, he identified as a homo-romantic solosexual. So intellectually and emotionally attracted to men on a romantic basis, but as far as having sex, not interested in really having sex with anybody other than himself.
And himself, right. So isn't that lovely that people are feeling more and more capable of just coming up with what feels right to them, instead of coming to the therapist and, well, what am I? What's the diagnosis? And again, none of these are diagnoses. These are orientations.
Exactly.
This is not an order.
We haven't had an orientation diagnosis since 1973.
Thank goodness.
And that's when I came out, because it's like, oh my God, and I had to go look the word up in the dictionary at the library because, I'd never even heard the word homosexual. So from 73 until now, from never hearing the word homosexual mentioned in any sort of polite society or conversation, it just wasn't something that was said, to having it taken out of the DSM as a diagnosis until now, you have a youth who can say things like homo-romantic solosexual. I mean, that's leaps and bounds. Of course, it took decades, but that's the thing about our profession that I admire, is it's willing to admit when it's wrong, and it's willing to take corrective actions.
Yeah. And even my projection, even with the asexual community, is that it will grow, that it won't be a 1%, because I think that, like you're saying, once the language is available, once the role modeling is available, people may feel more comfortable identifying as asexual, who prior to really understanding or seeing people even speak in that way wouldn't have conceptualized themselves in that way. And we see that with, gender too, right? So if girls don't see women in positions of leadership or power, it's hard for them to conceptualize themselves as a leader or potential for power. So I do expect some of those numbers to shift over the next decade or two, where we may see more people identify as asexual than we currently see.
And we keep saying asexual, but let's make sure that we're not coming across with that old binary thinking of asexual or not. If you'll go to the AVEN website, asexuality.org, and look through their FAQ, you will actually see that even they describe their community as a spectrum. It goes from completely non-sexual, asexual, to some very gray areas. And they even own it by calling it gray asexuality. That you're mostly asexual until certain circumstances occur for you. And again, that's up for you. That's up to your individual differences. Yeah. That's up to your individual situation. So again, things are not black and white. It's the wonderful wide world of technicolor out there when it comes to sexuality.
I think spectrum is one of my newest favorite words, like in my career, like the last, I would say 5 years or so, the spectrum, and that it doesn't have to be binary. And
I think it's one of the best mind shifts we've had in mental health in a long time.
Yes, I would agree, because they're even applying that now to like personality disorders and different traits. And it's like, it's not you are or you're not, it's more like, where are you on the spectrum? Of course, this has been a big shift too in autism treatment and all of that. So it's really exciting that we're making more room for the wide spectrum of humanity.
Absolutely. Bring it on. I love it.
Okay, well, as usual, if anybody out there feels like we have completely botched this conversation, like, I'm super open to hearing about that. If there were things that we've said that are helpful, we'd love to hear that. If you want to make comments about your own kind of journey and self-discovery and self-actualization, and whether or not you were offered neutral spaces to be able to do that kind of work, in your experience. We'd love to hear about any of those things. So by all means, make comments either in the comment thread, or you can always private message me or the Symmetry Solutions Facebook page. So Alan, thank you for your time. Colette, thank you for your time, even though you're not here anymore. And we'll see everybody next week. If you want to know more about us, you can find us at symmetrysouls.com or getmormonhelp.com. We have lots of groups. We have a lot of support groups that are that we've all kind of really made a push to have more group resources this year, as well as, of course, individual or family or couple counseling, whether through a therapy model, if that's your best fit, or a coaching model, depending on what's going on in your lives. So we will be back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary. It's nothing hard.